We have a crisis in the world, tremendous crisis, and also crisis in our consciousness, in us. I see the urgency of change, radical revolution, mutation in the mind. I see it. It is necessary. There is complete quietness of the mind, and that which is silent has vast space. Only then that which is nameless comes into being.
This is Urgency of Change, the Krishnamurti podcast. Liberation is not a form of snobbishness. It is there for anyone who will inquire into it. It is there with an ever-widening, deepening beauty and strength, when there is self-knowing. Hello and welcome to episode 250 of Urgency of Change. Each episode of the Krishnamurti podcast features carefully chosen extracts from the archives. The aim is to represent different aspects of Krishnamurti's radical approach to many of the issues and questions we all face in our lives. This is the final episode in Season 5, and the theme is liberation. Upcoming themes in Season 6 include communication, thinking, and awakening. This is a podcast from Krishnamurti Foundation Trust, based at Brockwood Park in Hampshire, UK. Brockwood is also home to Brockwood Park School, a unique international boarding school offering a personalised holistic education. It is deeply inspired by Krishnamurti's teaching, which encourages academic excellence, self-understanding, creativity, and integrity. Please visit brockwood.org.uk for more information. You can also find our regular Krishnamurti quotes and videos on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook at Krishnamurti Foundation Trust. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave a review or rating on your podcast app. This helps our visibility. This week's episode on liberation has 4 sections. This first extract is from the second question and answer meeting at Brockwood Park in 1981 and is titled, "Is Liberation Only for the Few?"
You say liberation is not an individual matter, but concerns humanity as a whole. Yet, liberating insight has been the unique achievement of individuals like the Buddha, like Christ, or perhaps yourself. How can it be a matter of the whole of humanity? First of all, let's leave the Buddha, the Christ, and the speaker alone. They are not important. Because there are so many. You know what disciples are? Disciples destroy the teacher. They invent a lot of theories, a lot of nonsense, write about it. They are the interpreters. And when they are interpreters, you know what takes place. So, let's look at the question very carefully. If we can liberate ourselves from these figures. Is insight, the liberating factor which is insight, is it an achievement? First, is it only granted or given to the few? Is it something that demands an utterly unselfish life? Is it something that is not personal? To go into this, one must go still deeper, further. which is the world is me and I am the world. That's a fact to me, to the speaker. The speaker is not separate from the world, and the world is not different from him. We have gone into this very sufficiently. Human consciousness, with all its content, which is belief, experience, knowledge, memory, fear, pleasure, suffering, pain, anxiety, loneliness, despair, and all the pain of the world is common to all mankind. This is so. It's common to all of us, whether we live a million miles away or very close. So, we are the world, psychologically. And you are the world. Now, is liberation, illumination, or that enlightenment only reserved for the extraordinary few? Or if you had the tremendous insight into the wholeness of life, your consciousness is totally different, right? Naturally. Because that liberating insight frees you from all the content of that consciousness. The pain, the anxiety, the loneliness, sorrow, depression, all that is wiped out. It's a fact if you do it. And it can be done. And it's not reserved for the few. But we human beings are not persistently, continuously applying. We are slack. We do this one day and we are weary of it the next day, we go off, so we keep. The ball is never in our court, it's always in other people's court. So if we are capable of maintaining, not by will, by perception, by seeing the fact, and remaining with the fact, without any movement away from the fact, then the fact undergoes a radical change. You can see this if you do it. That is, if I remain completely with violence, that is, not try to do something about it, because I am violent, then the very attention you give to that factor of sensation which is called violence, when there is this light of attention on it, it disappears completely, forever. If you do it, you will discover it for yourself. And if you, as a human being, who recognizes that you are the entire humanity, psychologically, the entire humanity, and therefore you are extraordinarily responsible, without any feeling of guilt, then your consciousness undergoes a change, obviously. That is the liberating factor of insight. If you have that liberating factor of insight and you have transformed your consciousness, you are bringing a factor of something new into the whole consciousness of humanity. You understand? I do not know if you have not followed a recent experiment which has been written about. Oh, I don't want to go into all this. Yeah, I've started, so I must finish it. They had put some rats in a tank of water. And there were two outlets. One, a dark one, and one with a light. When the rat climbed up the ramp and went to the light, which it thinks escapes through that, it gets a shock. So it comes down and goes to the other, which is black. Then it escapes through that. And they have generally the mother rat takes time to discover this. Then its children learn much quicker. Please, it's not genetic. They learn much quicker. And so, without taking many experiments, after a few experiments, they go off through the black and escape. And they were doing this in England, in Australia, and perhaps in some part of America. Totally different, not communicating with each other. And the rats in Australia, please listen to this, the rats in Australia discovered much quicker the black way of escaping, not through light. You understand this? No, I'm not going to explain for you. It's very simple. Without no genetics entering into it, the rats in England took time to learn, and the grandchildren or great-great-grandchildren learned it much quicker. 2 attempts and black out. The same thing happened in Australia. The doctors were not communicating with each other. So, they have discovered there is a group consciousness. As well as chemically, it is so. You understand? So this group consciousness, oh, I'm tired. Exists. And therefore, when there is one rat learns much quicker, that quickness is transformed, is given to the whole consciousness. You understand? So if you can answer from that. You get it? We have been talking about this for years. Only the rats. Only the rats have illuminated this. Our minds. Very interesting. Look how we are operating ourselves. We don't see something truth immediately. It takes time. Then we learn. And genetically we transform. We don't say, I won't go into it. So, we are saying, if you transform yourself through the liberation of insight, you are communicating to the whole of consciousness of man. You understand? This is happening. Like the great rulers of the world or the great killers of the world have affected the human mind, right? Attila, Genghis Khan, Hitler, Napoleon. On the other side, Buddha and so on. They've all affected the human mind, human consciousness. But if we actually daily live this intelligence, the insight of which liberates, then you are bringing to the whole of the consciousness of man a totally different air, different value, different movement, which is not based on knowledge, which is based on insight and intelligence.
The second extract is from Krishnamurti's second talk in Madras, 1964, and is titled, "Liberation is not an abstract idea."
To understand something completely, however trivial or great, one must give complete attention to it, untrammeled and free. Otherwise one can't understand. Especially in those things that demand careful study and intimate knowledge. To give attention, there must be freedom. Otherwise one can't attend. You can't give yourself completely over to something if you are not free. And to understand the extraordinary thing called truth, which is yet simple and at the same time quite complex, one must give this untrammeled attention. And as I said, freedom is essential. For truth does not belong to any religion, to any system, nor is it to be found in any book. You cannot learn it from another. Nor can another lead you to it. One must completely understand it and give oneself to it. So you must come to it free, untrammeled, and with a state of mind that has understood itself and therefore is free from all illusion. Freedom is becoming more and more difficult to be free. As society becomes more complex and industrialization becomes wider and deeper and more organized, as the organized man, there is less and less freedom, as one observes. When the state becomes all-powerful, when there is social welfare, the care of the state over the citizens so complete, the welfare state, that there is less and less freedom outwardly. And one becomes a slave to society. Outwardly, the pressure of society. control. Outwardly, there is less and less freedom. Where there is more progress, there is less freedom. This is obvious as you see it in every society as it's becoming more complex, more organized. So outwardly, there is the pressure of the control, the shaping of the mind, technologically, industrially, of the individual. Being so outwardly held, naturally the tendency is inwardly to become more and more entrenched in a particular pattern of existence, psychologically. Again, this is an obvious fact. So, for anyone who is serious enough to find out what is true, if there is such thing as reality, a truth not put together by man in his fear, in his despair, the truth that is not a tradition, a repetition, a thing that is an instrument of propaganda. To find that out, there must be completest freedom. Outwardly, perhaps there may not be, but inwardly, there must be absolute freedom. And to understand this question of freedom is one of the most difficult things. I do not know if you have gone into it at all, if you have even thought about it, what it means to be free. I do not mean the abstract, ideational freedom, liberation. That is too abstract, too far away. It may have no reality at all. It may be the invention of a mind that is in despair, in fear, in agony, and has constructed verbally a pattern, hoping to achieve a verbal statement, but not in actuality. We are talking of freedom not in abstraction, but actually, the everyday freedom. The everyday freedom inwardly. So psychologically, there is no bondage to anything. Is that possible? Theoretically and ideationally, it may be. But we are not concerned with ideas, with theories, with speculative religious hopes. But we are concerned with facts. That is it possible for a mind psychologically, inwardly, to be totally free? Though outwardly, you may go to the office every day, belong to a certain class of people, society, and so on, which you must, which is absolutely necessary to gain a livelihood. But will the stresses and strains of outward conditioning, outward conformity to the pattern of a particular society, will that control the psyche? The whole process of our thinking. And is there such thing as complete psychological freedom? Because without freedom, absolute psychological freedom, there is no possibility whatsoever of finding the reality, finding what God is, if there is such a thing. Freedom is absolute necessity. And most of us do not want to be free. That's the first thing to realize. So is it possible to be psychologically free so as to discover for oneself what is true? Because in the very process of understanding, or in the very act of understanding what is truth, you are then able to help your fellow man. Otherwise you cannot help. Otherwise you bring more confusion, more misery to man, which again is obvious, which is shown by all these saints. So, to understand what is true, truth which is not made manifest by another, or described by another, or told by another, however wise, however enlightened, is not true. You have to find it. You have to understand it. I withdraw that word find. You cannot find it. You cannot set about deliberately, consciously to find it. You must come upon it, darkly, unknowingly. But you cannot come upon it if your mind is, if your psyche inwardly is not completely, totally free.
The third extract is from the second talk in London 1969 and is titled Liberation from Fear.
For most of us, freedom is an idea, but not an actuality. When we talk about freedom or think about it, we want to be free outwardly, to do what we like. To travel, free to express ourselves in different ways, free to think what we like. The outward expression of freedom seems to be extraordinarily important. especially in countries where there is tyranny, dictatorship. And in those countries where outward freedom is possible, one seeks more and more pleasure, more and more enjoyment, freedom to possess. And in the search for freedom, if one is at all serious, there is not only the outward expression of that freedom, which must, it seems to me, must come from psychological freedom, the inward freedom. And if we were to inquire deeply what that freedom implies, freedom to be inwardly, completely and totally free, which then expresses itself outwardly in society, in relationship, then we must ask, it seems to me, whether human mind, heavily conditioned as it is, can ever be free at all? Or must it always live and function within the frontiers of its own conditioning, and therefore there is no freedom at all? Or verbally understanding that there is no freedom here on this earth, inwardly or outwardly, one then begins to invent freedom in another world, liberation, moksha, heaven, and so on. So if we could put aside all theoretical, ideological concepts of freedom and actually inquire whether our minds, yours and mine, can ever be free. Freedom from dependence, psychologically, inwardly. Freedom from fear, anxiety, the innumerable problems, both conscious as well as deeper layers of consciousness. Whether there can be complete psychological freedom so that the human mind, being freed from all problems, can come upon something which is not of time, which is not put together by thought, or as an escape from the actual realities of daily existence. If we could this morning go into this question, whether the human mind, yours and mine, can ever be inwardly, psychologically, totally free. Because without that freedom, it is not possible to see what is truth, to see if there is a reality, not invented by fear, not shaped by the society, the culture in which we live. Not as an escape from the daily monotony, the boredom, the loneliness, the despair, the anxiety. Because unless one is free, you can't explore. You can't investigate. You can't examine. And to look into it, there needs not only freedom, but the discipline that is necessary to observe. So, freedom and discipline go together. Not that one must be disciplined in order to be free. We are using the word discipline not in the accepted traditional sense, which is to conform, imitate, suppress, follow a set pattern. But rather, the root meaning of that word itself, which is to learn. So learning and freedom go together. Learning being, bringing its own discipline, not imposed by the mind in order to achieve a certain result. So those two things are necessary, essentially. The act of learning and freedom. One cannot learn about oneself unless one is free. And to learn about oneself, one must observe. Not according to any pattern, formula, or concept, but actually observe as one is. And that observation, that perception, that seeing, brings about its own discipline, its own learning, in which there is no conformity, imitation, suppression, control whatsoever. So freedom and learning are always together. And there is a great deal of beauty in that. Our minds are conditioned. That's an obvious fact. Conditioned by the culture, by the society, influenced by various impressions, strains, stresses, relationships. economic, social, climate, educational, religious conformity, sanctions, and so on. And our minds are trained to accept fear and escape, if we can, from that fear. Never being able to resolve totally and completely the whole nature and structure of fear. So our first question is whether the mind, so heavily burdened, can resolve completely not only its conditioning but also its fears. Because it is the fear that makes us accept conditioning. And if we may, this morning, please do not merely hear a lot of words and ideas which are really no value at all, but through the act of listening, observing your own states of mind, then we can together, both verbally and non-verbally, inquire whether the mind can ever be free from fear. Not accepting fear, not escaping from it. Not saying one must develop courage, resistance, but actually be fully aware of the fear in which one is trapped. Because unless one is free from this quality of fear, one can't see very clearly, feel very clearly, deeply. And obviously, when there is fear, there is no love. So whether the mind can actually ever be free of fear, that seems to me one of the most primary, essential questions which must be asked and which must be resolved for any person who is at all serious. There are physical fears and psychological fears. The physical fears of pain, having had pain and the repetition of that pain in the future. The fears of old age, death. The fears of physical insecurity. The fears of uncertainties of tomorrow. The fears of not being able to be a great success, achieve, and so on. not being somebody in this rather ugly world. The fears of destruction, the fears of loneliness, not being able to love or be loved, and so on. The conscious fears as well as the unconscious fears. Can the mind be free totally of all this? And if it cannot, then such a mind is incapable because it is distorted. It's incapable of perception, of understanding, of having a mind that's completely silent, quiet. It's like a blind man seeking light and never finding light, and therefore inventing a light of words, concepts, theories. So how is a mind which is so heavily burdened with fear and with all its conditioning ever to be free of it? Or must we accept it as inevitable thing of life? And most of us do accept it, put up with it. So, now what shall we do? How shall I, as a human being, and you as a human being, be rid of this fear, the total fear, not a particular fear, but the whole nature and structure of fear? What is fear? Don't accept, if I may suggest, what the speaker is saying. The speaker has no authority whatsoever. He is not a teacher. He is not a guru. Because if he is a teacher, then you are the follower. And if you are the follower, you destroy yourself as well as the teacher. What we are trying to do is to find out what is truth. We're trying to go into this question of fear so completely that your mind is never afraid. Therefore, you're free of all dependence on another, inwardly, psychologically. So we are taking a journey together, not being led. Someone ahead of you and you following in his footsteps. The beauty of freedom is that you don't leave a mark. The eagle in its flight doesn't leave a mark. Only the scientist does. And in inquiring into this question of freedom, there must be not only the scientific observation, but also the flight of the eagle that doesn't leave a mark at all. Both are required. Which is both the verbal explanation and the non-verbal perception. Bearing in mind that the description is never the described. The explanation is never that thing which is explained. That is, the word is never the thing. So if all this is very clear, then we can proceed to find out for ourselves, not through the speaker, not through his words, not through his ideas or thought, to find out for ourselves whether the mind can be completely free from fear. All right, shall we go on from there? Please, this is not an introduction. If you haven't heard the first part clearly and understood it, you can't go on to the next. And to inquire, there must be freedom, as we said. To look, freedom from prejudice, conclusions, concepts, ideals, prejudices, so that you can observe actually for yourself what is fear. And when you observe very closely, intimately, is there fear at all? That is, you can only observe very, very closely, intimately, what is fear, when the observer is the observed. And we're going to go into that. So what is fear? How does it come about? The obvious physical fears can be understood, like the dangers, physical dangers, in which there is instant response. That's fairly easy to understand, into which we need not go too much. But we're talking about psychological fears. How do these psychological fears arise? What is their origin? And whether they can end. That's the issue. What is fear? Fear of something that happened yesterday. Fear of something that might happen later on today or tomorrow. Fear of the known and fear of the unknown, which is tomorrow. The unknown being death and all the rest of it. We won't touch that, into that question, go into that question this morning. So, one can see for oneself very clearly that fear arises through the structure of thought. Thought, thinking about what happened yesterday, of which one is afraid, thinking about it, or thinking about the future, causes fear. Right? Thought breeds fear. No? Please, sirs, be quite sure. Don't accept what we're talking about, what the speaker is saying. Be absolutely sure for yourself that thought is the origin of fear. Thinking about the pain, psychological pain one has had some time ago, and not wanting to repeat it again, or have that thing recalled or happen, and thought, thinking about all this breeds fear. Right? Can you go on from there? No, because unless we see this very clearly, you won't be able to follow. Please don't ask questions yet. It's quite complex, this, so please, for the moment, just hold on to your question. No, don't hold on to your question. Drop your question, go on with it, what we're talking about. Thought, thinking about an incident, an experience, a state in which there has been a disturbance, danger, grief, pain, brings about fear. Thought, having established a certain security, psychologically, and not wanting that security to be disturbed, any disturbance is a resistance, and therefore fear. So thought is responsible for fear, as thought is responsible for pleasure. Right? One has had a happy experience. Thought thinks about it and wants it repeated, perpetuated. And when that is not possible, there is a resistance, there's anger, despair, and fear. So thought is both responsible for fear as well as pleasure. Right? This is not a verbal conclusion. This is not a formula for avoiding fear. That is, where there is fear, there is pain and pleasure. Pleasure goes with pain. The two are indivisible. And thought is responsible for both. Right? If there was no tomorrow or the next moment to think about either fear or pleasure, they neither exist. Right, sirs? Shall we go on from there? Not, please bear in mind, not as an idea, but an actuality, the thing that you yourself have discovered and therefore real. So you say, by Jove, I have found out for yourself that thought breeds both these things. You have had sexual enjoyment, pleasure. Then you think about it, the image, the pictures, the whole business of it. And the very thinking about it gives strength to that pleasure which you have had. And when that is thwarted, there is pain, anxiety, fear, jealousy, annoyance, anger, brutality. So thought is the origin of both. And we're not saying that you must not have pleasure. Bliss is not pleasure. Ecstasy is not brought about by thought. It's an entirely different thing. And you can only come upon that when you understand the nature of thought, which breeds both pleasure and fear. And when a mind seeks bliss or ecstasy, and there is such a thing which is not pleasure, and to understand that there must be real inquiry and understanding of fear and pleasure which is brought about by thought.
The final extract in this episode is from Krishnamurti's fourth talk in Paris 1961 and is titled, Can Liberation Be Realized by Everyone?
Is liberation realized by everyone? Surely it is not for the given to the few. I'm afraid liberation is not snobbishness. It is there for anyone who will inquire into it. It is there with a widening, deepening beauty and strength when there is self-knowing. And anyone can begin to find out about himself by watching himself. As you watch yourself in a mirror, the mirror doesn't tell you a lie. It shows exactly what your face looks like. In the same way to look at yourself without distortion. Then when you begin to find out about yourself, knowing yourself, learning about yourself. And learning is an extraordinary thing. Learning. To learn. I haven't time to go into that, we'll go into another day. So when you can go, the door to reality, to the immensity, is not through a church door, not through any book, but through yourself.